It's time for the Soteriology 101 podcast, where God is most glorified by his love and provision for all people. Welcome your host, the Director of Apologetics for Texas Baptists, an adjunct professor of theology, and a local teaching pastor, Dr. Leighton Flowers.
Hello, my name is Leighton Flowers, the Director of Apologetics for Texas Baptists. I wanted to respond to a link that was sent to me yesterday. I listened to it on my drive home. And I wanted to address this from both perspectives, from the non-Calvinistic traditional perspective, as well as, addressing some of the Calvinistic beliefs, because James White here in this particular latest broadcast from the Dividing Line went over a meme that was put up on social media. And of course, this is kind of new to our generation, memes, even Twitter and all these kinds of things. It's even affecting our political process. It's affecting our theology in some ways. And sometimes, obviously, meme theology is not the best way to do theology. And the meme that you're about to see is, admittedly, even from my perspective, offensive. And I don't think it's probably real healthy to have these kinds of back and forth. Memes can be funny, and I'm not trying to say somebody's sinning by creating a meme or anything like that. Some of the memes that I've seen out there, and I've even shared some at times just because I thought they were funny. And I take myself and some of these theological jokes less seriously than other people do, and so sometimes things can come across as more offensively than maybe they're even intended when put out on social media. But when you start dealing with really motive issues, the death of children or rape or incest or all these horrible kind of heinous things, which are really inerrant questions within the theological debate with regard to theodicy and within the Calvinism, Arminianism concepts of God's sovereignty and God's control, and how did sin enter the world, and who's really responsible for sin, who's responsible for faith and the lack of thereof. All of those kinds of questions come to play in these theological discussions, and therefore, when the outsider kind of looking into our theological bubble, where we're having these kind of intervarsity debates among ourselves, they can be kind of shocked by some of the things that we throw out there and that sometimes are said among theologians when trying to make a otherwise probably very valid point, but because it's used with emotive language or things that are very even seen as offensive, that sometimes the weight of the argument is lost. And I think that's the case with what you're about to see here. But I wanted to address it because I think it gets to a heart of a deeper issue. And it helps us, I think, to see a little bit better what is meant behind the words. I've talked about this before, is that oftentimes in these debates, these discussions, there's the accusation of misrepresentation. You don't understand what we believe. You don't understand what we're really saying. And one of the reasons of the 5 that I list for the accusation of misrepresentation, which goes both ways, is that concept of saying, well, something may be technically true, but you're not saying it in a palatable way. In other words, you're not saying it the way that I would want it to be described or said, but technically what you're saying is not inaccurate. And I think this also could apply to some of what this tweet is getting to in this particular meme. And so I wanted to address that, and then hopefully in more of a productive way kind of address Dr. White's Calvinistic views with regard to rape and other emotive issues as it relates to compatibilistic kind of thought among Calvinists, and what's behind the words. In other words, what do they really mean by that when they say it? What's really intended there? And again, I open myself. I never block the comments on my post or anything like that. I welcome your critique. You may say, well, you're misrepresenting us in this way or that way. I'm open to that. I like to have open dialogue. Believe it or not, I really do want people to understand Calvinism. I want them to understand it for what it really means, not necessarily with all of the politically correct, so to speak, language. Same true on our side. We can have certain things that we find mysterious or we don't have answers to, and so we can try to flower it up or use politically correct kind of language to hide our appeals to mystery. Any theological worldview can do that. And so I'm not trying to claim that one side doesn't have any mysteries and the other side has all their mysteries. I'm simply trying to help us to understand each other's perspective for what it really means behind the spin words that sometimes are used to kind of keep people happy with our position and keep people signing on and saying, yeah, I believe that. What do they really mean when they say that, though? Do you really believe what they're saying if you understand the definition of the terms and what's behind those things? So keeping that in mind and realizing I'm not supporting this methodology of having theological discussions, but I thought it a valid way in which to address some things I think that need to be talked about or that are profitable within a theological discussion. Let's listen in.
Grossly offensive. But again, it's helpful to understand what's being said out there. And it just seemed to be a bunch of this all at the same time. And that's why I mentioned it. But if you blow it up, it says, now listen, honey, I know you're upset that nasty man raped you. But Uncle James says God made him do it to give it meaning. And the pretty little girl says, really, Mommy? I feel so much better now. And this goes back, of course, to the Bryson abomination from a few years ago, where George Bryson just made things up on the fly. And we, again, documented it very clearly. Things in the internet. The internet has no immune system. And so infections just fester. And lies just have a life of their own in the internet. But I want you to see.
Okay, he's referring to a discussion he had on the Hank Hanegraaff Bible Answer Man program, which let's just play that for you to hear for yourself. That way no one can accuse me of misrepresenting James or Bryson or anybody else in the discussion. Let's just listen to them firsthand.
And this will put it into perspective to show the difference. When a child is raped, is God responsible, and did he decree that rape?
If he didn't, then that rape is an element of meaningless evil that has no purpose. What I'm trying to point out by going to Scripture... So
what is your answer there? Because I want to understand the answer to that question.
I'm trying to go to Scripture to answer.
Yes, but what is the answer to the question that he just asked so that we can understand what the answer is?
I mentioned to him, yes, because if not, then it's meaningless and purposeless. And though God knew it was going to happen, he created without a purpose. That means God brought the evil into existence. No, it was going to exist, but for no purpose, no redemption, nothing positive, nothing good.
So he did decree it, and if he decreed it, then there's meaning to it.
It has meaning, it has purpose.
Got it.
Suffering, all suffering has purpose. Everything in this world has purpose. There is no basis for despair. But if we believe that God created knowing all this was going to happen, but with no decree, he just created, and all this evil's out there and there's no purpose, then every rape, every situation like that is nothing but purposeless evil, and God is responsible for the creation of despair. And
Okay. And they go back and forth. You can see there, that's found on YouTube, BAM Debate. If you type that in, it'll come up so you can listen to the entirety. It's a good discussion. In fact, after listening to it, there's several things that are talked about in the discussion that are worthy of unpacking further. And I think Bryson and Dr. Hank Hanegraaff did a really good job of kind of trying to uncover behind the scenes of what Calvinists mean when they say certain things. And I think James White does a good job of representing Calvinism pretty accurately in this discussion. And so let's kind of go with what he was just asked. He was asked, does God determine, decree, cause even the rape of children and these kinds of horrible, heinous things? And his answer was clearly yes. If he doesn't, then it's purposeless. Well, my answer, one, to that is that there is evil purposes and there are good purposes. The fact that it's an evil purpose proves that it's not God's purpose. And so a child is being raped because some man has a sinful fleshly desire. And so therefore the purpose of that rape is to fulfill that man's fleshly evil desire. Now, that doesn't mean that God can't redeem that situation and redeem that victim and help that victim come out of that horrible situation. God can obviously work good out of that horrible, bad situation. He's the redeemer of evil, not the determiner of evil. He's not the decreer of evil. And so oftentimes what you'll hear James White and other Calvinists do is they will always go back to appeal to the omniscience of God, that if God knew it, then he must have determined it. because if he knew it before creating it, then by creating it, he had to determine it. But what you're doing, the finite aspect of that logic is that you're putting God on a timeline at some point in the past, a timeline that doesn't exist, by the way, within an eternal attribute of who God is, which again, this is all philosophy. This is way above our pay grade. This is not something we as finite creatures can even begin to understand. But when you say God prior to creation, what is prior to creation in an infinite being? This is why oftentimes philosophers will speak like C.S. Lewis does, and Aquinas does, and Boethius in his famous work from back in the 5th and 6th century, which was probably the most predominantly held view among theists, is the view of the eternal now view of God, that God is outside of time. There's a sense in which God can know all things in his eternal knowledge, but not gain knowledge in the way that we would gain knowledge, obviously. But that just because he knows something doesn't mean he necessitates or causes or determines something. And this is just as essential. You hear this in philosophical debates all the time, is the lack of ability to distinguish between that which is certain and that which is necessary. Those are two separate words. Something that is certain, for example, I may have a crystal ball, and I can certainly see what's going to happen in Moscow, Russia tomorrow at noon with this crystal ball. Again, this is a suppositional argument here, so I'm just supposing that I have a crystal ball that's able to see something that happens tomorrow at noon. Now, I'm over here in Texas. I have nothing to do with what's happening in Moscow whatsoever. I view through this crystal ball something that certainly is to happen tomorrow at noon in Moscow. Does my knowledge of that in any way necessitate what happens tomorrow at noon in Moscow? Of course not. It has no logical implication that knowledge that I am gaining today prior to an event happening in any way necessitates that it happens. Now, is it certainly going to happen? Well, yes, according to the suppositional argument here, that I'm looking at something that actually happens in the future. It is certain. It just wasn't necessary. Just like the things in the past. I ate a hot dog yesterday, okay? Is it certain that I ate a hot dog yesterday? Yes, it's certain that I ate a hot dog. That cannot change. It will not change that I ate a hot dog yesterday. I ate a hot dog yesterday. That's a certainty. Was it a necessity that I ate a hot dog yesterday? No, I could have refrained and probably should have refrained from eating that hot dog. You see what I'm saying? There's a difference between certainty and necessity. And sometimes Calvinists, like James White, conflate those two things and treat them both as if they're the same. That because something is certain, i.e. known by an eternal, infinite God, therefore it has to be a necessity. It has to be have been determined by someone other than the free moral agent that made the decision themselves. And so that's where the root of this whole thing gets back down to that, because every single time you go through these arguments with James, every time you hear him with Michael Brown or Bryson or any of these others, he always goes back to, did God know it before he created it? Did God know it before he created it? And again, he's confusing necessity with certainty. And he's not, I don't think philosophically, he's not primarily a philosopher, he's more of a theologian, as I am. I prefer to go to the text of Scripture and talk through what was the intention of the author in this text and what was he trying to say, and leave the philosophy to the philosophers, because those are just speculations or just guessing as to, okay, how does this work within the infinite world? And so getting back to the meme that was first introduced, where the criticism that he's bringing to that meme is when he says, well, God made him do it, the rapist, made him rape, okay? Well, even by James's own admission, God did decree, i.e. determine, for him to rape. We have quotes from, well, instead of me just saying it, look at the quote from John Piper. Okay, I know I've read this 1,000 times on the podcast, but I feel like I have to say this because I get so many messages from Calvinists saying, hey, we don't believe that, or we don't hold to that view. And I just want you to hear from one of the most prominent, Calvinists within our modern day, at least in my context within Baptist. John Piper is probably one of the most influential Calvinists among Baptists. He says this, he says, God brings about all things in accordance with his will. So brings about. Now, is it the same thing as he made him do it? Well, again, it's a verbiage thing. It's, again, PC language. What does it mean by bring about? And you have to unpack that. You have some Calvinists that will use the word decree. Some will use the word ordain. Some will use the word bring about. These kinds of verbs that are used. And so what's behind these words? Well, here in the same article, I've quoted from John Calvin and others who actually uses the term author, that God actually authors these evil things. And then there's, of course, some Calvinistic documents, the Westminster Confession and other things, that deny that God authors evil in any way, shape, or form. So keeping that in mind, it says God brings about all things in accordance with his will. In other words, it isn't just that God manages to turn the evil aspects of our world to good for those who love him. It is rather that he himself brings about these evil aspects for his glory. So let's just stop right there and understand what John Piper is saying through this particular article. What he's saying is that God doesn't just turn or redeem an evil act to make it into a good thing, or to bring good even from something that's evil, which is what obviously we would hold to. He's saying that God actually brings about these evil things for his own glory. And he even gets real specific here. He says, in his people's good, this includes, as incredible and unacceptable as it may currently seem, God having even brought about the Nazis' brutality at Berchowitz and Auschwitz, as well as the terrible killings of Dennis Rader and even sexual abuse of a young child. So I'm bringing that up because it's not just the memes that bring up these difficult, emotive, theological things. It's even the quotes from here, Mark Talbert and the editor with John Piper, Justin Taylor. These are all this is a Calvinistic source here, which it's cited there for you if you'd like to go look that up for yourself and see it in its full context, which I encourage you to do with all of these things. I want you to fully understand Calvinism from Calvinists. I want you to hear it from them. This is why I put their quotes on there. In fact, here's some quotes from John Calvin saying virtually the exact same things. Creatures are so governed by the secret counsel of God that nothing happens but what he has knowingly and willingly decreed. Thieves and murderers and evildoers are instruments of divine providence, being employed by the Lord himself to execute judgments which he has resolved to inflict. We hold that God is the disposer and ruler of all things, that from the remotest eternity, according to his own wisdom, he decreed what he was to do, and now by his power execute what he has decreed. Whence we maintain that by his providence, not heaven and earth and inanimate creatures only, but also the counsel and wills of men are so governed as to move exactly in the course which he has destined. I don't know how much more clear you can get than men are so governed to move exactly in the course which he has determined, he has destined, he has decided. So God is the one deciding the course of your choices and your actions. Again, there may be some people who deny this form of Calvinism and say, well, I'm not that much of a Calvinist. Well, that's fine, but don't accuse others of us not understanding Calvinism when we're directly quoting Calvin himself and many notable Calvinists that follow Calvin. And maybe you're a 4-point Calvinist, or maybe you're a lower form of Reformed theology that's not Calvinistic. So when you accuse scholars of the other persuasion of not understanding Calvinism when we're quoting directly from Calvin and Calvinistic sources, it gets a little frustrating for some of us to have a reasonable discussion with you. And so that's all I'm asking is just in love and respect, just maybe you don't understand Calvinism as well as you think you do. Maybe there are more sources out there than what you've been privy to over the course of your own studies. And so the person you're arguing with may understand Calvinism just as much or better than you do. So keep that in mind when you're having these kinds of discussions, and just preface the discussion by saying, well, hey, listen, I'm not a full-blown Calvinist here. I actually affirm a form of libertarian freedom, or say something to that nature. That way you can have a discussion, really not over Calvinism, but maybe over whatever form of theological, determinism or lack thereof that you hold to. Being clear to understand these things is really important. There's also one here that I wanted to point out, just because I think it's really important to understand when it comes, well, here's the individuals, these are all quotes from Calvin. Individuals are born who are doomed from the womb to certain death to glorify God through their destruction. In other words, this is kind of the root of Calvinism, that God has elected some for salvation, yes, but he has also elected or passed by and therefore chosen the rest for destruction to glorify himself. That's really the root of the disagreement that we have with Calvinists. There's also the one that I was wanting to find here. The first man fell. Here it is. The first man fell because the Lord deemed it meet that he should. Now, this is a big, big issue, because when you push back, which in the debate with Bryson, they actually go through this, where both Hank Hanegraaff and Bryson point White, okay, what about Adam in the garden? If you say a man always chooses according to his nature, well, then Adam had a good nature. Adam was created, in a non-fallen nature, and so therefore he chose to sin. Is he determined to choose to sin? Did God determine that, or was that a libertarianly free choice that he made? And of course, some Calvinists take different approaches on this. But you can hear from White's argument, he wants to get away from that pretty quick. And he says something about, well, we don't know much about Adam. We just don't know anything about Adam. All we know is about the fallen man. And but it's an important point, simply because it gets back to the root of the plausibility of libertarian free will, which men like Calvin and even I think James White would agree with Calvin, that libertarian freedom is just not logically possible in their mindset, that it's not feasible based upon their concept of omniscience, i.e. God knowing everything prior to to bring it to pass. Therefore, he determined it, he necessitated it. Again, confusing necessity with certainty. And so the man first fell because the Lord deemed that he should. I think Jonathan Edwards goes this far as well, where he actually tries to answer the question as to why Adam fell. Now, a lot of Calvinists will avoid this altogether. R.C. Sproul and I think Piper even have quotes where they'll say things like, well, we don't know why Adam fell. We don't know why the sin entered the world. We don't know why Satan fell. The Bible doesn't answer that question. And Sproul even says, I don't know anybody that answers that question or knows the answer to that question. And he certainly doesn't know the answer to that question. And so Calvin, at least in this particular quote, seems to be going further than some Calvinists are willing to go by saying that God deemed it, or that God determined or decreed for Adam to fall in this way. And then I think that can obviously be a big issue with regard to God's holiness and his separateness from evil. And we need to understand this. Our defense of human free will is not about us trying to gain power like Calvinists will sometimes paint us trying to do, or like we're trying to somehow worship at the altar of free will, or we're trying to protect our power. A defense of biblical free will is a defense of sovereignty, yes, and it's a defense of holiness, absolutely. Why? Because to deny free will is ultimately to deny God the power and the ability to maintain a world with free moral creatures, which is what I think the Calvinist ultimately has to do. What they're ultimately saying, in my estimation, is that God's not really powerful enough to have a world with free moral creatures. He has to be meticulously, sovereignly deterministic over the world in order to guarantee his victory. And the illustration we've used before is the man playing both sides of the chessboard. Which is more impressive, the guy that has to play both sides of the chessboard to ensure his victory, or the guy who's just so good at chess that he can take on any opponent and win? I think the latter is obviously more impressive, and that's more my view of God. He doesn't have to determine his choices in the same sovereign way that he determines his opponent's choices in order to ensure a victory. A guy is actually able to take on free, autonomous moral creatures and still maintain and guarantee his victory because he's God. He doesn't have to determine everything in order to ensure his victory. God's bigger than that. So I think free will is actually a defense of sovereignty, because it's saying our view of God is higher than the deterministic view of God, because it's much more impressive and sovereign in the sense of having free moral creatures versus God creating a world of automatons, as C.S. Lewis describes that. And so we are defending sovereignty, and we're also defending holiness, God's character. Character of love, that he genuinely loves all people, that he's provided for all people, that when he calls people to salvation, he genuinely wants all people to come. So we're defending that character of God, that he's trustworthy, that he means what he says. He doesn't have an outward statement that means one thing and a hidden decree that is working against that statement in some sovereign, meticulous, deterministic way. We don't believe that. So we're defending, from our estimation, a character of trustworthiness. We're defending his character of love for all people. We're defending, from our estimation, his character of being right and good, that he is not the determiner of rape. He does not bring to pass the rape. He does not bring it about. He did not want it. As Jeremiah chapter 7 talks about, that when they're killing their children to Molech and burning them, that God says, I didn't command that. It didn't even cross my mind. This is something he's trying to communicate. This is so distant from the holiness of my nature. It didn't even cross my mind. Now, you can have philosophical discussions of what it means that something didn't cross the mind of God. That's fine. But obviously God, in his inspired word, was willing to utter those words. That did not cross my mind, to try to communicate something. Could it be that he's not trying to communicate that he meticulously brought that to pass for his own glorification, as the Calvinist would ultimately have to interpret that passage to be to mean ultimately behind the scenes, that God actually determined and or brought to pass the murder of these children, the sacrifice and burning of these children to Molech. He actually brought it to pass for his own self-glorification. According to the quote above and these quotes from Calvin, that's ultimately where they're landing on that. And I just don't think that that's a biblical perspective. I don't think the Bible ever supports that kind of concept. So with that in mind, let's go back to the video here.
And
That means God brought the evil into existence. No, it was going to exist, but for no purpose, no redemption, nothing positive, nothing good.
So he did decree it, and if he decreed it, then there's meaning to it.
It has meaning. It has purpose.
Got it.
Suffering, all suffering has purpose. Everything in this world has purpose. There is no basis for despair. But if we believe that God created knowing all this was going to happen, but with no decree, he just created, and all this evil's out there and there's no purpose, then every rape, every situation like that is nothing but purposeless evil, and God is responsible for the creation of despair. And that is not what I believe.
For years I've been trying.
Okay, before you hear Bryson's rebuttal there, we need to understand this is how you distinguish between which is good and evil. It's purpose. If it has an evil purpose, then it's evil. It's not of God. It's not God's will. It should not have happened. It's bad. But what the Calvinist has done is conflated the two to make everything God's purpose. That everything that happens, the rape of the child is God's purpose. The everything's God's purpose. And then he'll use unique examples of God using, for example, Joseph being sold into slavery, or Pharaoh being hardened, or the Syrian king that's brought against Israel for an act of judgment, all of which I have articles talking through from our perspective. We're not hiding from that, as White accuses us of traditionalists of doing, that we're not willing to tackle those texts or take them on. I've got articles and broadcasts and books, and there are other traditionalists with books and broadcasts on that. So when he paints us as hiding from those things or not giving a clear and decisive answer of how we understand those things, then he's just misrepresenting our perspective. Just so those who listen know that we do have answers to these things from our perspective. Now, you may not like them, but at least don't say that we don't have any. That's just misrepresentative. And so what you have here is White saying that it's either purposeless evil. No, evil has a purpose. It's an evil purpose. That rapist wanted to satisfy his own sexual gratification in an evil, horrible way. That was its purpose. To call that somehow God's purpose, to decree, i.e. to determine, i.e. to bring it about for his own glory, muddles the water of it being an evil purpose. Because how can you bemoan something that God brought to pass for his glory? Don't you want God to be glorified, Calvinists? Of course you do. So if God decreed for rape in order to bring himself glory, then why are you bemoaning rape? Why are you putting down rape if that's what's done for his greatest glory? It doesn't make any sense. When you conflate those two things, when you call something being brought to pass for God's glory, you can't denounce it on one hand and say it was decreed by God for his greatest glory on the other. Because you're ultimately saying that what God decreed, what God did for his greatest glory, is evil and bad. And you can't do that. You can't call something that God actively brings to pass for his greatest glory evil and bad, can you? Of course not. That's why you have to draw the distinction between those two things. And of course, we do believe that God created free moral creatures. And in creating free moral creatures, he allowed for mutability, the fallability, the ability of the free agents to fall and thus suffer the consequences due to their free moral actions. And thus all the sin, the rape, all these other things, yes, God has a purpose in allowing for free moral creatures to act. We think that that purpose is love. We think that's genuine relationship, as explained in other theodicies and things that you can read in other places if you want to study those things. There is a purpose in creating free moral creatures. There's not a purpose, at least a godly purpose, in those free moral creatures acting against the will of God. To try to suggest that God has a purpose in every action of free moral creatures to go against his purposes and his plans is just simply a farce and not a biblical concept at all.
Trying to figure out why it is that in order for rape to exist, or unless God caused it to happen, there can't be any purpose in it. God can use evil, and he does. But to blame God, which is what a decree does, to blame God for the rape of a child is a horrible attack on the very character and
How
the
about,
love of God.
How about to blame God for the destruction of the heart of a father, thinking that his son has been killed for many years, the weeping that he underwent? Genesis 50:20 has not been answered yet. And Acts chapter 4 tells us that the early church believed that Pontius Pilate and Herod and the Romans and the Jews, in the crucifixion of the sinless Son of God, which I believe we would all agree is the greatest evil that man has ever committed, that took place on the basis of the sovereign decree of God, Acts chapter 4, verses 27 to 28. If you could tell me...
So the proof that God worked to bring about the crucifixion and redemption of sin, is there proof that God causes or decrees all the sin that was redeemed? That's ultimately what you're going. That's tantamount to coming across a police officer who is conducting a sting operation to catch a notorious drug dealer. And that police officer obviously worked to bring about that particular drug deal at that particular moment, at that particular time, with this particular group of people. Okay, we know that that's what a drug sting is, or an operation is. And so you observe that drug sting and you walk away concluding that police officer has determined every single drug deal at all times in that city, and every single intention of every single drug dealer to sell drugs at all times in that city. Obviously preposterous, right? That's exactly what I think Calvinists are doing with regard to the crucifixion and other redemptive acts that God has worked in to redeem, to bring about good through the evil moral actions of man. And God does, as Bryson argues, I think aptly in this discussion, God does determine some things. God does cause some things. God does redeem certain sinful, morally sinful acts for a greater good purpose. We know within the lineage of Christ there are prostitutes and probably rape situations and things like that that actually lead to the birth of Jesus Christ himself within that lineage. There are some horrible things that happen in the history of the church that God uses and redeems for a greater good. But it undermines that redemption to suggest that God is the one who somehow decreed the very intention of the heart of man to do that very evil thing that's talked about. And if all things include truly all things, as Calvinists teach within their confessions, that God decrees all things that come to pass, well, the evil intention of that child molester is a thing. Did God decree that thing? You'll hear James White in this discussion often say, well, God restrains man's evil. What's he restraining if mankind does not have a free moral autonomous will, James White? Is he restraining something he's already decreed? Makes no sense. Only way you can talk about God restraining man's evil is if you establish that man has a free moral will with which to restrain. Otherwise, you just got to have God restraining himself, God restraining his own evil decrees. Doesn't make any sense. You use the example of Joseph selling his brothers, and you talk about, well, Joseph's brothers, they wanted to murder him, and God restrained them from murdering. Well, let's back up a step. Why did they want to murder? According to Calvinists, all things are decreed by God. That means their desire to murder their brother was decreed by God. God brought it to pass for his greatest glory. So God is restraining them from doing that which God himself determined and or decreed and or brought to pass for his own greatest glory. Again, it makes no rational sense to have God restraining the very things that he has decreed to come to pass. You got God working against himself. You have to establish free moral will in order to establish the concept of God permitting and or restraining anything. The only way to really maintain a consistent Calvinistic worldview is to hold to meticulous deterministic detail of every single minute thing that happens, which is authoring all things. In other words, it's the author. He's the one who's writing every detail. He's the one who's coming up with every nuance. He's the one who's writing the desire of every agent within that book. He is the author of all things. And I don't know how Calvinists can consistently say they do not believe that God is authoring these evil things and the evil intentions and desires of man at the same time holding to a consistent form of compatibilistic thought. And so listen a little bit further to this discussion.
Both what you believe Acts 4:27 to 28
means let me ask you if you think that rape is a sin.
I believe that. Can we use a biblical example? Acts 4:27 to 28.
Rape is a biblical issue. Is rape a sin?
Just as the crucifixion was a sin. Yes.
Okay. So
Okay. Did you hear what James White does there? he equates the sin of the crucifixion with the sin of a rape. Okay, so he's equivocating those two things. In other words, God brought to pass the rape of children in the same meticulous, deterministic, sovereign way that he brought about redemption for that sin. You capture that? Okay. So God's bringing about the very thing that he's redeeming. In other words, you've got God cleaning up his own messes. God's coming to redeem the very things he determined to happen. Makes no sense. It does make sense, just like in the analogy of the police officer using a sting operation to stop evil people from doing evil things, and to redeem an evil situation, to use a sting operation, to use these evil desires of these drug dealers to bring about a good purpose. It makes sense for God to meticulously work within a situation in time to use the evil intentions of hardened Israel to bring about the redemption on the cross, which is, of course, our perspective. We do believe God hardened Israel in their rebellion. We do believe God used their hardened rebellion. That's exactly what the objector in Romans 9 is objecting to. God, if you're using our rebellion to bring about your redemptive plan, then why are you to blame us? That's the objector in Romans 9. The objector in Romans 9 is not defending Calvinism. He's defending the judicial hardening of Israel to bring about his redemptive plan. The objector in Israel is the drug dealer who just found out that he was trapped. And he would be saying, that's entrapment. Why are you blaming me? You're the one who set up this whole drug deal. Why are you even blaming me? Well, the reason I'm blaming you is because you're a drug dealer. The reason I'm blaming you is because before I ever knew you, before I ever got involved in you, you have been dealing drugs. I just used your intention to deal drugs for my own good purposes. I just used your evil actions to bring about something good for what I wanted to accomplish. And so Calvinism doesn't allow for that, at least James White's form of Calvinism and Calvin's form of Calvinism for that matter. It doesn't allow for God to have the freedom to use opportunities like the evil intentions of Israel to bring about the crucifixion of Christ. And simply because we don't understand all the nuances of how God works meticulously within that time and space doesn't mean that God doesn't have ways that are higher than ours and that he can work in those ways to redeem our messes. He's not cleaning up his own mess. He's cleaning up the mess of free, autonomous, moral creatures. And I think that has to be established.
Does God decree, and therefore is God the cause of sin?
Again, as you well know, having read all of these things, let me just read this into everyone's hearing so they can see it. The early church said, "For truly in this city they were gathered against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, both Herod, Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur." And so here is an example where men committed evil, and they did so at the predestining purpose of God. God is glorified. His intention is positive and good. The intention of Herod, the intention of the Jews, these were not innocent people, and God standing behind them with a big gun, pushing them down the road going, be evil, be evil. In fact, how many times did God restrain them?
So they're making a choice in the process.
And
in your view.
They're not only making a choice.
So they have the ability to choose.
Within the realm of their nature, since they are fallen. Remember, God restrains men from committing evil. Let me ask you, do you believe that?
Why are men fallen? That's the question.
Do you believe that?
The question is, why are men fallen?
Could I finish a point here? Do you believe that God can keep someone from sinning?
I would like to ask you the question, is God the cause of that sin? That's the issue.
I've already pointed out
God
in Genesis chapter 50 that God's decree is based upon his good intention. Can God keep a person from sinning? Will he violate libertarian free will to keep a person from sinning? Yes or no?
It's not a yes or no question. The issue here is, and I think we really need to focus in on this. For the average person listening, they want to know, is God morally responsible for the moral evils of our world? When something really, really bad happens, such as the molestation of a child or the murder of a mother, they want to know who's responsible for this. And I think the Bible makes it clear that God can't be touched with that. God is righteous and holy. He's beyond that. He's merciful and he's gracious and he's loving. Calvinism has reduced good and evil to really the same thing. It's just simply saying God has decreed all of these things, and they try to make flowery distinctions between them, but the point is they make God responsible and therefore God to blame for what the Bible says he's not to blame.
Again, we're talking to...
Okay. Notice I want you to back up, and if you have to play it again, do so. But listen to Hank Hanegraaff's what he's trying to get into. He's trying to say, so what you're saying is that man's free to make a choice in that situation. You're saying he's free to do a choice. And notice James White doesn't ever just say, oh, yes. Well, because if he does that, then what he has done is he has admitted that mankind, at some point at least, has some form of libertarian freedom. And of course, James White doesn't believe that libertarian freedom is ever possible. He believes it's impossibility. It's against the nature of God, because that would undermine his quote unquote meticulous sovereignty. And so that's important. And this gets to really the heart of the issue as to what is this thing called compatibilism. And again, we've gone over this in some other shows, and this is what I want to hear, an actual Calvinist say it in a debate, and then unpack more of what they mean behind the terms. Because a Calvinist will often say, well, I believe man's acting voluntarily. I believe they're acting freely in some way. I believe they're acting in accordance with their nature. I believe they're doing what they want to do. They'll say things like that, but what do they mean behind that? What they don't mean is this. They don't mean that the man could have refrained from that thing. The man could have not done that evil moral thing. It was a necessity. It was necessary for that person to do it, because God foreknew that he would, therefore it was certain. Again, it's confusing certainty with necessity, as we've already gone over. But look with me at monergism.com. This is the website that was sent to me, we've gone over before, that was sent to me in a discussion I was having with James White that Phil Johnson from Grace to You Ministries with John MacArthur got involved in. And then Phil Johnson sent me this link saying, well, you obviously don't understand compatibilism. Here's a link, read this. And so from then on, I've been using this because I love this link. I love it because it's clear. It does not hide what Calvinistic compatibilists mean. So oftentimes, all these flowery words, as Bryson just put it, all this PC language buries what they're saying. And again, as I started off this, I want you to understand Calvinism. I want you to fully vet and understand what they believe, so you can vet it. You can't vet something you don't really understand what's happening. I want you to vet Calvinism. So I want you to understand Calvinism for what it is. In order to better understand, theologians have come up with the term compatibilism to describe the concurrence of God's sovereignty and man's responsibility. Compatibilism is the form of determinism, and it should be noted, notice this position is no less deterministic than hard determinism. Please understand that. I cannot tell you how many messages from Calvinists I get on a weekly basis that talk about how they are not determinists, and they don't believe in determinism, and that they think I'm misrepresenting Calvinists as determinists. Listen, compatibilism, which is the view that most leading scholarly Calvinists are holding to, that are promoting Calvinism, believe this right here. Compatibilism, which is no less deterministic than hard determinism. It simply means that God's predetermination and meticulous providence is compatible with voluntary choice. What is voluntary choice? Well, he explains. Our choices are not coerced. And James White gets into this with the meme that he was discussing earlier, where God's not holding a gun to anybody and forcing them to do something against their will. They're doing what they want to do. But here's the question behind that James White rarely talks about. Why do they want to do that thing? Ultimately, they want to do that thing because God has decreed it. God has decided, he has determined man's nature, which ultimately determines man's desires within the given preset circumstances that God has determined. Now you may think, well, that's just totally misrepresentative of us, Leighton. Let me read for you. It says, in light of Scripture, according to compatibilism, human choices are exercised voluntarily, but the desires and circumstances that bring about these choices occur through divine determinism. Can that be any more clear right there? Desires are brought about through divine determinism. For example, and then he uses the example of the crucifixion just like James White does. God used the evil desires in such a way as to bring about redemption of sin. Therefore, God, according to them, brings about all evil desires for all sin that he redeemed on Calvary. Again, it does not follow. It's not a biblical concept in my estimation, but that's the argument they're making. If they can say, I can give you one example of where God used the evil determinations of man for his greatest glory. Therefore, it must mean that God always uses every single evil action and intends every single evil action for all of time for his ultimate purpose and good. So therefore, all evil actions and everything that happens is ultimately God's decreed purpose for his own glory, for a good thing. Everything that happens, every single sinful thing, every single immorality, every single errant doctrine, my doctrine, according to the Calvinist, what I'm teaching you right now was decreed by God, according to the Calvinist. So how consistent is a Calvinist to say, Leighton, man, he is so stupid. He got on the broadcast and did all these stupid things. You're ultimately criticizing God because God decreed for me to do this video broadcast right now. God sovereignly decided that Leighton would believe what Leighton believes and would get on YouTube and produce this video right here for his greatest glory, mind you. So if all things, including rape and Leighton's doctrinal viewpoints and his YouTube videos, are decreed by God for his greatest glory, what are you denouncing? What are you getting angry at? You're getting angry at what God has decreed for his greatest glory? Really? Okay, be consistent then. Why is it that men like A.W. Tozer, C.S. Lewis, and even myself have rejected Calvinistic thought? If as regenerate men, and some people may debate that point, but most mainstream Calvinists do believe there are non-Calvinists who are regenerate. Well, why are there regenerate men who are not Calvinists? I think that's a valid question that Calvinists have to answer. And I don't think they can give a consistent answer to this question, because ultimately what they have to say is that God has granted some of his children the grace and the ability to adopt right soteriological doctrine, and has restrained or withheld other of his children from understanding those things. He hasn't quite given them enough insight, quite given them enough grace. Otherwise, you have to affirm a form of libertarian freedom among the regenerate, where God has allowed for a level of freedom among his saved to decide whether they're going to freely adopt Calvinistic thought or refrain from adopting Calvinistic thought. And the Calvinists that hold to that viewpoint are affirming our concept of libertarian freedom. They're saying that it is possible for God to grant libertarian freedom, the ability to refrain or not refrain from given moral actions, ability to act upon desires versus being determined by the nature in the circumstances to which those desires could not be other than what they were. That's ultimately what it gets down to in these particular situations. And so notice I'm quoting for them. I'm letting them speak for themselves. Desires occur through divine determinism. So God is determining man's evil intention to rape that child on that meme that he's talking about. And yet he'll say, he'll confront the concept of that God made him do it, and say, well, God didn't make him do it with some gun pointing at him. Well, God did make him do it in the sense that his desires, i.e. nature, is determined by God within the circumstances that are determined by God. And so what's really the difference? If I hold a gun to a man and tell him, go rob the bank or I will shoot you, obviously I'm forcing him to do it against his will through a gun. But suppose I give the man a drug in his coffee that he's unaware of, and he takes the drug in his coffee and it makes his chemical imbalance in his brain to where he takes any suggestion that I give him and he desires and wants to do that thing on his own, within his own chemistry, within his own body. Is that any less deterministic? Simply because I use some kind of inward manipulative means to change his desires and his wants? If I'm controlling his desires and his wants, how is that any less deterministic? That's exactly why Hendricks in this article says this is no less deterministic than hard determinism, because he recognizes the fact that yes, people are acting voluntarily. They're acting according to their wants, but their wants are decreed by God. Their desires, according to their nature, are decreed within the circumstances that God has decided. So technically, that horrible, very difficult to read meme is technically accurate if you understand made him do it, as in sovereignly brought this thing to pass for his greatest glory, which is the flowery PC way of saying the exact same thing that meme is saying that's horribly offensive. So Calvinists, why is that meme horribly offensive to you? If this is the system that you hold to. Now, if this is the system you reject, if you're hearing this and you're going, no, that's not what we believe, no, that's not what we believe, then join me. Join me in coming against the Piper quote that I just read to you, all the Calvin quotes that I just read to you, James White saying that, yes, God decreed for the rape of these people for his own good purpose. Otherwise, it has no good purpose. Come against that with me, and let's stand at least on the same side, even though we may have some other sociological differences. Let's stand at least on the same side of affirming a concept of libertarian freedom by which the origin of evil is not God's decree, but man himself, that God decreed not which choice we would make, but that we would be free to make it, as A.W. Tozer convincingly argues. That a God less than sovereign would be afraid to sovereignly create free moral creatures. He wouldn't be able to do so. So again, I'm just calling us to a higher form of God, a higher form of sovereignty, a form of sovereignty that does not undermine the holiness and the goodness of God, and that does not create this kind of meme culture where people have probably a fairly sound argument to make against the God of Scripture by making those kinds of accusations about God, because ultimately you can't deny the validity of such horrible, heinous causes like that. I think this is vitally important, and I think this is even an issue that John Calvin himself admitted was a problem from him. Look what he says. Okay, I'm pulling this up from my book. This is on page 55 of my book, The Potter's Promise, and it's quoting from John Calvin, the eternal predestination of God, page 124. He says, "How it was ordained by the foreknowledge and decree of God what man's future was, without God being implicated as the associate in the fault, as the author or approver of transgression, is clearly a secret so much excelling the insight of the human mind that I am not ashamed to confess ignorance. I daily so mediate on these mysteries of his kingdom that curiosity no longer to know anything more does not attract me." In other words, I'm giving up trying to answer the question as to how God ordained and decreed man's future without being implicated as the fault or the author of transgression. It's a secret, he says, is so excelling, he's not willing to even entertain it anymore. He's just accepting theistic determinism. God must have determined it because it's all that his finite mind can fathom, so it just has to be so. See the problem with that? Again, I just want you to recognize Calvinists have the same appeals to mystery as other systematics do. The difference is that the question ultimately is the mystery afforded by the text, is the mystery that we hold to afforded by the Scripture, is the mystery we're holding to ultimately what God wants us to hold to based upon the revelation of Scripture? Because all of us have mysteries. Anything dealing with the infinite nature of who God is going to have a mystery. We've got to accept that. We just don't have to accept, I think, the concept that God is somehow ordained and or decreed and or determined and or brought to pass the intentions of rapists for his own glory. I just don't think that is ever a biblically taught concept, and it's something I think some Calvinists have simply taken too far.
Thanks for attending our online university classroom. Remember, this is a listener-supported ministry, so please consider becoming a patron of the podcast by donating online. Join our team and help spread the word. For more resources, books, and articles from Professor Flowers, or to learn how you can support this ministry, please visit www.soteriology101.com.